Andy Johnson, Minnesota State University. We are looking at RTI, standardized tests, screening devices, and dysgraphia. So let us begin. How do students respond? RTI stands for Response to Intervention. As the name indicates, the goal is to see how students respond to an intervention. Students' response to the intervention determines whether they get additional help. Now, there's a screening of some sort to begin the process. If problems are identified by the basic screening, students start in Tier 1. If they don't respond here, they move to Tier 2. If they respond, they quit the intervention. In other words, if the intervention is successful, students should not need the intervention. But if they don't respond to Tier 2, then they move into Tier 3. Now keep in mind that interventions of any kind are designed to become obsolete. Interventions are not meant to be forever kinds of things. If your RTI is successful and students have responded to your intervention, you should not need the intervention. All RTI should fade away. But we know that's not going to happen. But in a perfect world, it would. RTI was not meant to be a permanent set of ability groups occurring outside the classroom. However, the question is, if students respond to Tier 2, do they go back to Tier 1, or are they forever fixed? And do they leave RTI completely? And if they respond to Tier 3, do they go back to Tier 2, or are they forever fixed? In reviewing some schools' RTI plans, a standardized reading achievement test is used as a screening device. Students are put into Tiers 1, 2, or 3 reading intervention groups based on their percentile rankings on these standardized achievement tests. For example, if you're in the 10th percentile or below, you go to Tier 3. If you're in the 11th to 40th percentile, you go to Tier 2. And if you're in the 41st to 60th percentile, you go to Tier 1. What could be simpler than that? However, when you live in the world of standardized tests and percentile rankings, there is a normal distribution of scores that is beautifully displayed in the bell-shaped curve. Here, half the population is reading below average. That's called a normal population or a normal distribution of scores. But if everyone was reading above average, eventually average would become below average, and above average would become average, and below average would be really below average. In the normal distribution of scores, half the students in a school should score below average. That's called normal. That doesn't mean that we don't give each and every student all the help they need so that they're reading, writing, and doing math at their very best. We want all students to read at grade level. It's an excellent goal, but at the same time, it's an unrealistic goal. In a normal distribution of scores, there will always be a 10th percentile, a 40th percentile, and a 60th percentile. But the real problem is this. If percentile rankings are used to determine tiers, you essentially create perpetual ability groups, some of which must leave the classroom to get extra help. And the problem with pull-out services is this. What do you pull them out of? What is so unimportant that students can miss it 3 to 5 times a week? A little bit more about screening devices. Let's take a look at these. RTI calls for some sort of screening device to determine if students are responding to instruction in a general education classroom. Another problem with using standardized tests for a screening device is that they do not match classroom instruction, hopefully. In other words, Good reading instruction in a general education classroom looks very much different from the content on a standardized test. RTI calls for benchmarks, measured 3 or 4 times a year to determine if students are making adequate progress. Benchmarks are the goals teachers set for where they think students should be in terms of progress and performance. The screening device used for initial assessment should be somewhat related to benchmarks or goals. Now, are you going to give a standardized test 3 and 4 times a year? Finally, the screening device should have some semblance to the progress monitoring measures. Progress monitoring are the quick, simple assessments measured every 2 to 4 weeks to see how well students are responding to the intervention. And of course, since progress monitoring measures the response to instruction taking place, they should be directly related to the instruction taking place. It does not make sense to teach one thing and measure another. I know what you're thinking. Okay, Mr. Smarty Pants, what would you use for a screening device? Now, what I would suggest for a screening device for reading, a simple maze, page or paragraph. Remember, it's a screening device, not a diagnostic. Maze can be quickly given in large group. You could have 2 or 3 maze pages or paragraphs over successive days. You could have varying levels. The maze is great for word recognition because readers have to use letter clues as well as semantic and syntactic clues. And readers are also using the context of the page or paragraph to create meaning or to comprehend. And the maze is more like real reading. Now, what about writing? RTI, reading, math, and writing. RTI focuses on these. For writing, you really can't give a standardized test, can you? Although some people have tried really hard to do this. Yes, you can measure spelling, grammar, and punctuation in artificial context on a standardized test, but these are not writing. There are also computer-scored writing assessments where students are given a writing prompt and given a time limit. The sentence structure and grammar of the written products are analyzed and scored. As well, there are writing tests where students are given a writing prompt and a time limit, and the writing samples are sent off to be scored by human scorers using rubrics, who score them on structure, sentence, mechanics, and other things. But these are all surface level measures to an artificial writing instruction situation. So how would you determine if students have writing difficulties? How could you determine who was and was not a struggling writer? Well, you could collect writing samples. These would be 2 or 3 samples of authentic student writing products based on their ideas and written using the process that real writers use. Pre-write, draft, revise, edit, and get feedback. Then you'd use some sort of holistic scoring measure like a rating checklist to rate students' authentic writing products based on a set of criteria. But the question is, why? Most writing disabilities are really teaching disabilities. Everybody can learn to write, and everybody can achieve their full writing potential if they're taught correctly within a general education setting. This means teaching the process of writing, pre-write, draft, revision, edit, share, and then repeat as necessary. Now, this doesn't mean that there aren't places for small, temporary, flexible groups to work on specific things, but tier 1, 2, and 3 for writing? What about dysgraphia? Maybe struggling writers have dysgraphia. That's it. How do you cure dysgraphia? For goodness sakes, you give it a fancy name. You give it to something and it becomes a thing. You call it a brain disorder, and it becomes more of a thing. You get for-profit entities selling products and doing workshops, and it really becomes a thing. So let's look at some stuff you can find on the web. Dysgraphia, spelling, poor handwriting, and trouble putting thoughts on paper, a neurological disorder. Written expression impairs writing ability and other fine motor skills. The Center for Learning Disability says that trouble forming letters, grip on the pencil, difficulty following a line or staying within margins, following rules of grammar when writing. To which I would say, pish posh, forming letters, holding a pencil, staying within the margins, even rules of grammar. These can all be magically cured by a computer. And by the way, difficulty organizing or articulating thoughts on paper, that's called a first draft. If you would have seen the first draft of this podcast, I would have been diagnosed with dysgraphia. Now, there are subordinate categories. Some groups like to break dysgraphia down into into motor dysgraphia, spatial dysgraphia, and linguistic dysgraphia. And then the educational system can say that it's not that we don't know how to teach writing. My goodness, they have a brain disorder. They got themselves a case of dysgraphia. It's their fault. It's a medical thing. And I see a lot of imperfect thinking going on here, a lot of clown-based thinking. Dyscalculia? Again, I'm a literacy guy. I swim in my own lane. But again, giving a name to something does not make that something more of a something. Now, once upon a time, RTI was designed to get students who are struggling with reading, math, and writing the immediate help they needed without them formally identified by the special education system. The whole point of RTI was to avoid special education services. It was never meant to be an extension of special education services. Now, as stated earlier, RTI was used as a method to identify students for special education services in the areas of learning disabilities, not EBD. It was only after students failed to respond to Tier 3 interventions for reading, math, and writing that they'd be considered for assessment for special education services for learning disabilities. Learning disabilities, difficulties in reading, math, or writing. Learning disabilities, not emotional behavioral disorders or behavior disorders. Now, IDI defines a learning disability as an imperfect ability to listen, think, speak, read, write, spell. Not included in that list of imperfect abilities is an imperfect ability to behave or an imperfect ability to emote. A learning disability is not a behaving disability. A learning disability is not an emoting disability. It's an imperfect ability to learn things. In regards to RTI, it's an imperfect ability to learn to read, write, and do mathematical calculations. It does not include learning problems. It does not include emotional behavioral disturbance. Emotional disturbance or environmental, cultural, or economic disadvantage. Learning disabilities does not include these problems. Now, some will say that behaviors get in the way of learning. It's the behaviors that are the cause of the learning difficulties. If those darn students would just behave correctly, then they'd learn. The problem is with the students. The student is defective. The student must be modified or changed. So we began to see behaviors and behavioral interventions creeping into RTI. But don't be fooled. Once behaviors are included in RTI, it's no longer RTI. It's something completely different, like MTSS, multi-tiered systems of support. Some RTI plans include PBIS, positive behavioral interventions and supports, even ABA, applied behavioral analysis. Now, to be clear, RTI is concerned with reading, math, and writing. Yes, behaviors sometimes get in the way of learning, but behaviors are a result of multiple causes. Behaviors are an effect of something else. To try to duct tape over the effect without addressing the cause demonstrates imperfect thinking. RTI is about learning disabilities. Learning disabilities. It was designed for learning disabilities, not disorders of emotions or behaviors. Why are behaviors getting mixed up in the whole RTI thing? RTI, while not perfect, is pretty good. Then along came MTSS, multi-tiered systems of support, and the question is, why? Academic systems, behavioral systems. Which of the two do you think gets emphasized? Well, behavior does, because we can measure it, you see, and we can modify it, you see, and you get these colorful diagrams with analogies and descriptions and pictures of smiling kids and happy, positive words, my goodness. And the question is, why? Why? Why did you mess with RTI? It was a good thing.